Hello, this is Diane Dalton. We're starting in Chapter 4 of the database class. Before we get started too far in this chapter, I want you to go back to the chapter on page 119, the first page of the chapter, and read the note. The important thing is that if we've made changes to our database in the examples done in the last chapter, that our database won't match the results in this chapter. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wipe out the database and start over creating it again from that initial SQL query. So let's go to our database server, and I'm going to take my Premier database. I'm just going to right click on it and I'm going to delete it. This will just delete everything in that database. It says, do you really want to do this? Yes, because I can restore it very easily. Alright, so it's done that. It's removed that database. Alright, so now I'm going to recreate it. So this is what we did in Chapter 1. I'm going to go back to Databases, New Database. I'm going to call it Premier and take all the defaults and say OK. Alright, so I have the database again. Oops, and I spelled it wrong. I suppose I should correct that before we go any farther. Rename. So I just did a right click and rename, corrected my spelling error, and since there's no data in there, there's no issues with doing that very quickly. I'm going to open that SQL file that we had used before. It's for the premier.sql. I'm going to open that, and I'm just going to execute it. Remember, this creates each of the tables, and it creates all of the data, inserts all the data. So we'll have our databases back to the original condition. If I look here, and I can see I have all of my tables. The first new topic in the advanced topics is about views. So what is a view? It's just a different view into the database. It gives that user only the information that they need to see or what they want to see, and it will hide other information. And this is done for simplification, so that if somebody needs to do a query into the database, they can query actually a view. But it also is good for security, because it hides some of those fields that the average user may not need to see, and you don't want them to have access to changing. So let's look at it some more. To create a query, you use a defining query. So that's a definition. That defining query is actually a select command that creates the data that goes into that view. And it can include multiple fields of multiple tables. And it can use a criteria to select only specific records. So really that query or that view acts as a window into your database. It does not actually produce a new table, but it does create a new object, a view, that you can run a query against. If you do a query against that view, you're not actually running the query against the view. The database management system is actually taking that query and merging it with the query that was used to create the view, and the resulting query is what's run against the database. So let's go to SQL Server, and we had our tables open. So now we're looking at this area called Views. We haven't seen that before. We're going to right click and create a new view. And we're going to use the one in the textbook example from the part table. And that's the only table in this one. We're going to output the part number, the description, on hand, and the price. But we're also going to put a criteria. We're only going to show those that are in the housewares category or housewares class. So I have to scroll down here where I see class. I'm going to put in my filter, housewares, but I don't actually want to include that in my output. So I uncheck the output box. Here's the query that's being built. So I'm going to be selecting part number, description, on hand, price from the database is the part table where class is housewares. So if I run that query, it shows me what my results are. I actually have 3 items in that class. So that's my query. Now in SQL Server Management Studio, I need to save that query, and I'm going to save it as housewares. I'm saving that as a view. And now when I go to my views, I see the housewares view. Let's see what we can do now that we have this view called housewares. We can create a new query from that view. So we're going to go create a new query. I'm going to go do this in the graphical user interface in the query by example. So I'm going to go to my query editor. And now previously, every time we picked a table from the query, we picked from the tables list. See this table? This time I'm going to look at the views list, and I see my one view that I've created called housewares. I'm going to add that, close, and as you can see, it has only those 4 field names that we had requested before. So this again is continuing the example in the textbook, and this time we are looking for anything that has the number of units on hand is less than 25. So I put in that filter, say OK, and when I run this, now it's giving me only the 2 records that meet that criteria, has less than 25 units on hand. So that's how we use a view, and it looks very similar to using a table in a query.
The next topic here is going to cover security. The section in the textbook in Chapter 4 is rather weak and incomplete, so I'm going to go work through this in SQL Server Management Studio, showing you how to add another user and give them permissions to access parts of the database. Right, so this is our instance that we've installed of our database management system. Within our database system, we have 3 databases that we've installed. But our first level of security is to go into the security at this point. And what we're going to do, let's look at the logins. This is myself. I'm the owner. I've installed this. But then there's all these other default logins that are set up. What we're going to do is going to add another login that's authenticated to log into this database management system instance. And what are we going to use? Okay, I'm going to search for a current user. And I'm going to use one that's already set up on this system called a NOS student. I'm going to check for the name. And yes, that ID exists as a username on this Windows PC. All right, so it recognized it. That's the PC name. And the NOS student is the name of the user. And I'm going to leave this with Windows authentication. Now, that means that this user might be logging into a local computer, or Windows authentication will also work if you have a username that's logging into an Active Directory domain. I could go over here and look at server roles. If I were to give this person a sysadmin role, then they would have permission to do anything within the database. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to go back to those general commands, and I'm going to select all the rest of the defaults. So really all this is doing now is identifying a new person that has permission to access this instance of a database management system. That's step 1. Now what I need to do, I'm going to go into the Premier database. Within the Premier database, there's an additional security tab. So I'm going to expand that, and what I'm going to do is now add a new user that's allowed to use the Premier database. And what's that going to be? That's going to be NOS. What I'm going to call him now is the Inventory Manager. And that's just the username that only exists within this Premier database. But his login name, search here. Again, I'm going to look NOS student. Check for that name. Yep, that's the one. I'm going to say OK. That's the login name for the Inventory Manager. Now, instead of picking a default schema, what I'm going to go do is look at securables. Let me pull this into view a little better. I'm going to look at the securables. These are different objects within the database that you can give specific permissions to. So I'm going to search. So what type of object do I want to add? I'm going to look at specific objects. It says what object types? Let's see. Well, here's the different types of objects that you can have in your database. So I could give permission by an entire database, by stored procedures, which we'll cover next, a table, or a view. So for this person, I'm just going to give them permission to look at views, a view type. Now I have to pick which view I'm going to give them permission to look at. And as it turns out, this housewares is the one I'm looking for. All right, so what I'm doing, again, is I'm giving this user, whose user ID within the database is called Inventory Manager, and their login is NOS student. So they're going to have permission within the housewares view. Now I get down here and I say, okay, what kind of permission do they get to have? All right, well, I certainly want to give them permission to select something, so I grant them that permission. Well, let me give them a chance to update data. Perhaps if they find that there's an error, they can correct something, or they can change the inventory amount. And I'm also going to give them permission to insert new items. Perhaps they come up with new products that they're going to offer in their stores. All right, so I'm granting them specific permission. And in this case, that's all I'm going to do. All right, so we've set this person up as a new user. Here they are, called Inventory Manager, and they have permission to look at the view, the housewares view, and that's all. Now we're going to have to log out of here and log in as that user to be able to test this out. So you won't see this while I'm logging out of one user and logging in as the other.
I'm logged in now as the Windows user login NOS student, and I'm going to open up the database. So I've made all the changes to give this user, who I've named it within the database, the Inventory Manager, given him access only to that view that we created for him. So since I haven't used this before, Microsoft SQL Server 2012, I'm going to open the Server Management Studio. Okay, and my connection came up and it shows me my username. This is the computer name and this is my username, NOS student. And that's how I'm going to connect. And I've already given this user permission to connect to the database instance. Let's make this fit in my window. Right, so I have access to the database, so I can get into the engines. And what I was given was permission only to look at the view in the Premier database. So let me open that. Let me look at the views, and yes, I can see this view. I can, in fact, here's the view. I can, in fact, write a new query. Don't need these properties open. I can put a query. I can do it in the editor. Looking at the view, housewares. I can select all the columns, and I'm going to filter on what has less than 25. We've done this before. And I'll execute that. And yes, this user is able to get these results. All right. Now, let's see. Can I go look at the tables? No. See, they are not showing up here because I do not have access. This user was given access only to that one view. Let me go see if I can look in Henry Books database. No. The database Henry Books is not accessible. I did not give this user access to the Henry Books database. Only the system administrator right now has permission to get into the Henry Books. I should get the same message if I try to look at Alex Mara. I should get the same error if I try to look at the Alex Mara database. So that shows that you can give specific users access to very specific items and grant them permission to do only specific actions. Now I'm going to go ahead and do another query on the Premier database where I'm going to insert a new value into the view. I'm going to insert into housewares, values, and what are the values? They need to be a part num, in J35, I don't think that's been used, a description. What's a new appliance? How about a waffle maker? How many do we have on hand? We've just ordered a dozen of them, so that's how many we have. And what's the last field? And these sell for $35 each. Right, so now I have a insert query that's going to add data to that view. So let's go execute that. And I did have permission to access that view. So let's go look at our view. I'm just going to open the top rows. Now, the reason I'm not seeing this data is because I'm not putting in a class. I don't have a class number here, and since this query is on class, it can only show things that are in that class. So I'm going to have to go back and look at through the system administration view and look at the file table, the actual data table for the part number, and see if a new part was created that includes a waffle maker but does not have a class type in it.
I'm logging back in now as the system administrator, which is D. Dalton. So I'm connecting now to my SQL Server as the administrator. And you can always see that when you see the instance, that you can see what user is logged in. We often have this screen smaller, so you can't see that, but it is there. Let's go look at our databases. We're going to look in the Premier. What we wanted to do was see if that insert query that was done by NOS student, the inventory manager, actually went into the data. So let's look at our part number. And yes, it did. Now, if you recall, the view contains only 4 of the columns: part number, description, on hand, and price. So it left the class and the warehouse null. Null means that there's no value there. Doesn't mean it's blank, doesn't mean it's 0. It means that there is no value stored. But because the class did not include hardware, HW, or housewares, because the class did not include HW, the view, in turn, does not include this record. So the view does not include this record because this HW is not there. So in reality, this was not a good setup, because if the inventory manager were able to insert data, you would want that data to be visible to that person again. So what we would want is to have the class included in the view, so that when he updates the view, the class is entered as well.